5 years, increasingly outshining its competitor Boeing. And let's start, so welcome again, Guillaume. We start with a little game. I read a sentence to you, and you have to find the number of paradoxes, like strange contradictions in it, yeah? Please count. I read the sentence now. Airbus is a highly functional European project.
0.
Which is really strange. Cooperatively initiated by Germany, France, and Spain. Second paradox. Which as a European high-tech company has managed to outclass its major American competitor. Third paradox, almost never happens. And emerged stronger from the crisis of the pandemic. So I was wondering, with all these strange circumstances, do you wake up sometimes in the morning and think yourself, how did this all happen? Why are we successful at all? It just isn't, it can't be true, right?
Well, we're looking forward more than backwards, but you're right, it's important to understand why we're successful. And I think it comes down to maybe a small number of things. Long time ago, some people with very strong political will and vision, excellent engineers and entrepreneurs coming together with a project that was a crazy project at that time. But I think that the today's main factors for success are the following, and let's look at commercial aviation. I like to say, if we had today one aircraft manufacturer in Germany, one aircraft manufacturer in France, one aircraft manufacturer in the UK, and one in Spain, there would be none. There would be 0. Mm-hmm. We are what we are today because we've come together and we've created the scale for this industry that is big enough to compete with our American friends and competitors. We're in industries where scale is important, huge investment, a lot of skills and technologies which are involved, and a rather small number of products. So if you're subscale, it's extremely difficult to make it. If you are at the right scale together, well, we have proven that we can make it, and we can make it over time. And actually, there are few other fields where, as Europeans, we manage to do this. And one frustration is really that in defense, we're really struggling to be doing this at a time where defense and security, as we've heard already, is so critical. Mm. But I would say it's a lot of factors. Obviously, it's not down to one, but the fact that we have accepted, as Europeans, to share the sovereignty in terms of commercial aviation 40 years ago has, over time, led to the conditions for being strong, for being competitive, for being innovative, because we have fantastic skills in Europe. Mm. But we are, most of the time, missing that scale when competition is with big players in the US or tomorrow in Asia and in China, for instance. Mm.
If you turn that around for a moment, so if you think, so you are obviously a successful running European project. What could the project of Europe learn from Airbus?
I think it's quite simple, is what I tried to share in my previous answer. As long as we remain fragmented, we are subscale. Scale is not important and critical in all industries. But today, more and more, with technology, with innovation, it requires huge amount of investment. Subscale means you can't make it. As Europeans, we are the largest market in the world. The economies together, I mean, we have the number 3 or 4, we have the number 5 or 6, and so on. Europe is the biggest market in the world, and we are the biggest player when it comes to the capability of delivering sophisticated products. But we have to come down to that scale. We need to be able to, or willing to abandon a bit of national sovereignty for the sake of European sovereignty. Mm. Abandon a bit of the idea of national success against other nations of Europe for the success of Europe in the world. I think that's really what is at stake, at least in the fields of business where we are working, which is commercial aviation, defense, security, helicopters.
it has become somewhat of a sport in newsrooms to count incidents involving Boeing airplanes these days. So we have to talk about Boeing. I was asking you before, can we talk about Boeing? And you were like, yeah, let's try. So how do we respond to people afraid to board an airplane these days? You know, with video footage from the Alaska Airlines, everyone saw that. And what do you tell people who are afraid?
Well, I will not answer that question directly, but I will say a few words. First, we are obviously in an industry where quality and safety is the top priority. That's absolutely clear. And we have managed, as an industry over time, to become the safest mode of transport by far, not by a little. Okay? There are something like 1.5 million fatalities on the roads in the world every year. Aviation that transports more than 4 billion passengers a year comes down to a very small number. It's dozens. So this industry delivers a very safe mode of transport overall. But what is interesting is the less accident we have, the less each and every accident acceptable, which is good news for passengers. The aviation is attracting a lot of attention on the safety. That's good, but it's a lot of pressure. So what I take as a learning for us, for Airbus, is humility, no complacency. And I'm not happy of the problems of my competitor, because that's not something good for the industry as a whole. And we really want, as Airbus, to make sure we learn all the lessons from our own issues, but also from the ones of others. So these are opportunities to learn, to continue to improve, and continue to do better. In an environment that is a difficult one, we are with supply chains that are really disrupted by what happened during COVID and have not yet recovered from what happened 4 years ago. At Airbus, we're still producing by far less planes than we were producing in 2019 when we were hit by the pandemic. So this industry has not yet recovered, and that's something that we have to take very, very serious.
You're booked out until the end of the decade, right? So there's a lot of pressure on you to deliver planes, to ship faster, do night shifts, for example. You never would do that, right?
Oh, of course, we have night shifts, yes, of course.
Yes, and what do you do about, so how can you guarantee in this high-pressure environment to have all the security in place, but which is obviously a major problem in the Boeing outlets?
What is important for us is first and
at least, right? So there's a lot of pressure on you.
Standards we have and we're committed to, and that can be operated safely, just to be very clear. In 2021, we redefined a role
to deliver planes
that was counting on around 20. To the have to face reality. And I think that's very close to what we heard already this morning. We have to adapt to the reality, face the reality.
If you need to travel from Paris to Frankfurt, you're going from Paris to Frankfurt, train or plane?
Depends. Depends. I like the not necessarily between train and plane. When there is a good railway system in place, that's very nice.
So you could take the TGV 3 hours, 43 minutes from Paris to
I do take the TGV quite often to the west of France or to the southeast. That works very well. As a boss of Airbus, I do take the train. I think it's a very good mode of transport. But I think you're going to something else.
Yes, there's this ban for short-haul flights these days. So France established one. I think Spain is in a discussion of doing the same. So if there's a time span of 2.5 hours, you shouldn't use planes. You can't use planes. It's forbidden in France now. Do you think that that's a problem for your business?
Well, I think it's dogmatic. I think it doesn't fit with the reality, the economic reality that we're in. And most of the time, plane is not in competition with train, it's in competition with car. And that's done on the back of carbon emissions. Well, actually, if you fly a commercial plane from Paris to Toulouse, They are by far less carbon emission than if you do it by car, except if you are 4 in your car. So it's very dogmatic. This is political. This is not what engineers would do looking at facts and figures. Therefore, I don't like it. I'm completely against these kind of measures. But I'm not suggesting we should not decarbonize aviation. Of course, that's a top priority that is in front of us. And that's what Airbus has engaged very strongly in 2019. And we want to lead the industry for the decarbonization of aviation. But the mode of transport that aviation represents is a great mode of transport. You don't need an infrastructure on the ground. So you don't need to damage the ecosystems that we pretend to protect by reducing carbon emissions. And that's something, I think the bigger picture of this is not very well represented.
Did you expect yourself, so many experts were surprised when we had this explosion in demand globally after the pandemic. So everyone's, and Boeing is really struggling, you are really struggling to deliver, to ship. So have you been surprised? And can you explain why this happens at all, after all these Fridays for Future discussions we had in Europe?
So I think this discussion is very European, very West European discussion. If you look at the broader world, the appetite for traveling, for moving on the planet is very strong. And in emerging countries, they're just at the beginning. I think we're at the very beginning of aviation. There's no other mode of transport that has so little externalities than aviation. Carbon is the exception. So we need to deal with the carbon matter. But you don't need an infrastructure. Actually, the infrastructure is the air. It's completely natural. You don't need to damage each and every kilometer on the way between A to B. So aviation provides a very fast, efficient, and safe mode of transport. Now, I will come to your point. I have been surprised by the robustness of the backlog of Airbus, the number of planes we have contracted during COVID. The airlines have been working very hard to not let their slots, their production slots, go to others.
Yes.
Why?
There's some dealing going on in the background all the time about these slots, right?
No, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. And probably less than what you think. Why is it so strong? Because this industry is growing. So first, there is a growth to serve. But this industry is also looking at its competitiveness and its impact on climate. And when you buy a modern plane, the one that is for sale today, you have a very strong alignment between economical interest and ecological interest. When you buy a plane that burns 20 to 40% less fuel than the one it's replacing, you are by far more competitive and you are by far more protective of the environment. We have a strong alignment for the planes. And for the other ways of decarbonizing, for instance, going to sustainable aviation fuel, you don't have this strong alignment. So for airlines, it's a no-brainer that you're much more competitive and prepared for the future, decarbonized world, if you have a modern plane rather than if you have an old one. And that's true for us and for the competitor, and that's why we see so much demand in a world where we see aviation on the rise again.
The products of your company are responsible, if I'm not mistaken, for something like 1% of global carbon output per year. That could be right. So air travel would be something like 2.4%. Half of the fleet is yours. So 1% is on your bill for carbon, right? So I was wondering, what's your perspective on long-haul flights, especially, which are 70% of this output? When will we see a substantial decarbonization or zero-emission flights on this planet? 250, 235? What's your vision? And with what kind of fuel, if you...
You allow me a long answer to this one?
Please.
I think we're really at the core.
6 minutes and 28 seconds.
Okay. So you're touching important points. Airbus, as a company, has a Scope 1, Scope 2 emission. So the emission, the carbon emission of Airbus as a company, that is less than 1 million tons. So that's actually quite small compared to the figures we are mentioning. But what we call the Scope 3, which is the emissions of our customers, of our airplanes in service, is indeed half of the aviation emissions. And aviation is indeed 2 to 2.5% of the carbon emissions of the world. 50 gigaton of carbons, 1 gigaton for aviation, and if you cut by 2, the scope 3, okay, the carbon that our customers are emitting by burning fuel in our planes in 1 year, that's indeed roughly half a gigaton, so 500 million tons. That's a great responsibility. That's also a great opportunity. Because if we find the right way to decarbonize, and we think that's where we are, we can not only influence the 8% of emissions of aviation in Europe, we can influence 50% of the world aviation emission, and why not more if we have a bigger market share, which we think we can achieve. That's what we're doing today with the single aisle. What's the way to get there? Actually, we are in the fourth revolution of aviation. The first one was to make planes fly. The second one was to make them fly safely. The third one was to democratize, and that's what we have done. It's very cheap now to fly with planes. And the fourth one is to decarbonize. How do we do this? First, we have to replace the current planes that are burning a lot of fuel by planes which are burning by far less fuel. That's why we have so much demand. That's what we're doing now.
You're good at that.
And those planes are already certified today for 50% of sustainable aviation fuel in the mix of jet fuel in the tanks of the plane. So we can go up to 50% of SAF with the current planes. The next stage is to develop a new generation of planes that will burn again 20, 25, maybe 30% less fuel, and certified for 100% of sustainable aviation fuel. That's the trajectory. And the ultimate way to fly will be not flying with SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, where you take carbon from the air and you put it back in the air when you burn the SAF in the plane, but it's to fly with hydrogen, because when you use hydrogen on board, there's zero carbon, and if you put it in a fuel cell, there's no emissions at all. And we will come to the market for the first time with a hydrogen plane by 2035. So today, there are different types of challenges. One is on the technology of the planes themselves. We will do it. We know how to do it. This will happen. The other part is the SAF. As I explained earlier, a plane that is burning less fuel is more competitive. Airlines are buying them. Unfortunately, that's the opposite for the sustainable aviation fuel. A SAF is more expensive today than a jet fuel. Therefore, if you are ahead of the others in burning SAF, you are less competitive. And here we need the regulatory framework to encourage, to twist the situation so the SAF becomes the way forward, and then we will see production and consumption rising. And that's where we have difficulties today. We have a lot of challenges, and we have decided at Airbus to play a role of catalyst for the industry. We partner with a lot of players to accelerate the ramp-up of sustainable aviation fuels. We would need a global framework to do this because it's all about level playing field. And unfortunately, that's not what we have today. We have regulation by regions. Europe is going with a very constraining regulatory framework and taxes. We're in Europe. The US are going with incentives. China is going with a vision for the country and a very top-down approach, but that's not going to work at scale, so we need to continue to work together. The recent steps last year with ICAO were very positive, but still that's the most challenging part of what we have to do. And to your question, I think on the short haul and the single aisle, we'll get there quite quickly. On the long haul, we will have to rely a lot on sustainable aviation fuel, and we are far from where we want to be. The roadmap for aviation, that is the industry roadmap, that has been supported by the countries of the world at ICAO 2 years ago, is to be carbon neutral by 2050. We know how to get there. There's a credible trajectory, but it comes with huge investments, and investment will be coming if the frame is clear and stable. And that's not yet the case, but the world is making progress in that direction, and I am day by day more optimistic on the speed at which we will get there on the fuels.
There has to be something like a Tesla moment at some point in time in air travel, right? Where suppliers of technology totally switch their technology to other fuels and stuff like that. The whole infrastructure has to change. And it's a little bit like in the car industry, maybe. some years ago. And nobody was expecting that, and suddenly it flipped. And what's your kind of strategic plan to, you have all these suppliers, you have this terrible, terrible supply chain, you have to change everything. How do you do that?
So we will judge the Tesla moment with more hindsight, okay? But still, they've been a big disruptor of the industry. And a lot of car makers didn't believe in electric mobility. Well, we have to come to the conclusion that there is a place for electromobility. Electromobility for us, or disruption for us, is in our view the hydrogen plane. A hydrogen plane is the disruption in the sense of completely getting rid of the only remaining issue for aviation, which is carbon emissions. But it's a very different fuel with very different characteristics. Why do we believe in hydrogen? Because flying is all about weight in the air. You have to pay a very high energetic price for 1 kilogram in the air. Therefore, it's all about weight reduction. Jet fuel, the traditional fuel we're using, has 12,000 watt-hours per kilogram, 12,000 units of energy per kilogram. A battery is 200 to 500, maybe one day 1,000 watt-hours compared to 12,000. That doesn't work for us. But hydrogen has 33,000 watt-hours per kilogram. So it's a fuel with huge energy density per kilogram. Well, hydrogen is not used today in aviation. You need to store it in a tank that needs to be isolated because you need to be at minus 253 degrees to store your liquid hydrogen on board. That's what we do on rockets, to some extent on satellites. We need to bring it to aviation. That's what we're doing. We are convinced at Airbus that we will master the technologies to be on the market by 2035 with a small hydrogen plane, and others are already working on it on smaller planes. The issue is we need as well a regulatory framework for hydrogen planes, and this is not existing today, so we have to embark with us a lot of people to create that regulatory framework, and we will need, and that's probably the bigger challenge, enough green hydrogen at the airport in 2035, at the right place, at the right price, at the right quantity, and that's another challenge. And we're coming back to the real challenge, in my view, of the decarbonization, which is the energy transition. Today, the world is using 80% of its energy is coming from fossil fuels, 80%. If we want to be decarbonized by 2050, this 80%, that is huge. Aviation is just a small part of it, needs to become decarbonized. We want to go to SAF first, and for long on the wide bodies, and then to hydrogen, which is another sustainable aviation fuel. We have the roadmap, but we need the bigger ecosystem to want to get there, and not want to oppose, or delay, or tax, or doubt. No, as said before, we need action. We have an action plan, and we want and need to have a lot of supporters to help aviation get there, because then we have the ultimate mode of transport on the planet. An airport at the beginning, an airport at the end. You can connect all points. You don't need an infrastructure. It's the air.
We get kill signs already. I'm just dealing if we get 5 more minutes, because I had 2 last Tesla moment questions for you. We didn't address the fact that you are also really big in defense, right?
Thank you.
It's the second part of your business, which is a major chunk. And just one question, because we addressed that on stage before, and Mr. ZEIT-ONLINE was here. So Europe increased its budget in the last 20 years for defense, maybe 20%. Russia maybe 300%, China 600%, something like that. What would you recommend for Europe? So I know this is, not an easy task for you to navigate. How big of a budget would we need for Europe to keep up with this development?
Indeed, we are a security and defense player, and that's really at the core of what Airbus stands for. We're actually the biggest defense player in the EU, and number 2 if we take the bigger Europe, with BAE System being bigger than us in defense. And actually, that share of Airbus is very small compared to the rest. That speaks for defense in Europe being very small compared to what it is in the US or in China or in Russia. Actually, let me make one important point to respond to your question. The defense spend, or the spend for defense goods in Europe is 4 to 5 times smaller than what it is in the US. So you take the US spend for defense goods, we are 20% of this, 5 times smaller, 4 to 5 times. And then you take that small slice, you have to cut it again, because we're buying in Europe, out of this small slice, only 20 to 25%. The rest, the 80%, is procured outside of Europe, mainly from the US. And the US is mainly buying from the US. So when you look at what we're producing, designing and producing in Europe, it's what, 20% of 20%? How much is it? 4 to 5%? And then on top, we don't have one system like in the US. The US is buying one system for the United States. We are using this to develop and buy national systems in most of the cases. It's a miracle that we're still alive. No, but seriously, why are we still alive? Because we're using some tricks. First, we cooperate. So we manage sometimes to bundle forces together. Well, that remains the exception. We are a bit this exception because at Airbus, what we do is what we do together in terms of defense systems. Second, we're using another very powerful trick, which is duality. We develop systems, technologies, bricks, that can be used for both commercial, civil, and military. One example is the MRTT, the tanker. It's an A330, result of a cooperation, that is militarized, duality, and we use the third trick, we export. Without export, we don't have the scale. Well, we're not necessarily as good as the US in export, but still, that's a way to increase scale. And the advice I would give, or it's not an advice, I mean the call, is for Europe to come together on defense. That's the only way forward. Why are we not doing it at scale? Because security and defense remains a national sovereignty, as if we would still prepare for going at war against each other. Let's be clear. Well, that's not what we do, fortunately. But if we would really think defense of Europe, we would come together as Europeans, and then we would have the scale that is similar to what the US are doing, or maybe with a smaller budget, but we would overcome what I said before. So the first priority is to buy European. The second priority, or the first priority, is also to buy together, and therefore to specify together. Well, in a word, think European for defense and security, and less national. But it's a very challenging task for head of states. How can you say to your voters, well, we will abandon part of the national sovereignty on security and defense and give it to Europe? How do you do this today? But if you don't do it, we will remain a very small player in this world, and that's no good news for the security and the defense of Europe. So I really believe we need to do more together as Europeans in defense, or we will continue to go down and disappear from that world. And that would be really bad news for the ability of Europeans to decide of their own future, of what they want to do, how they want to behave.
Last question. The very last question, do you have only one sentence? And it's a complicated question.
Yes or no?
Then sentence, several words. There's a third area, space, which you're really active in. It used to be the largest provider of civilian space technology. So 7 years ago already, you had the Tesla moment because SpaceX, founded by a guy called Elon Musk, surpassed Arianespace. And since then, you're building this Ariane 6 rocket. It delayed and again delayed. Now it's rolling to the starting point. And I think this summer you maybe have a launch. So last questions. Will we see a launch this year of Ariane 6? Well, yes or no?
I think I can answer yes.
Thanks. Thank you very much.